So to save on ROM space, many Atari 2600 games didn't have a title screen. Centipede, on the other hand, had a really impressive one showing great detail, which is unlike anything you usually see on the console. How did the developers pull this off? And on the other hand, why does the actual gameplay look worse? Couldn't they just copy and paste? Well, I have the answer. Let's take a look. What's up guys, it's Poger. How y'all doing? So we're going to talk about that nice looking title screen. We're also going to talk about the developers a little bit too. Atari published this, but they didn't develop it. So the actual company that created Centipede on the 2600 was commissioned by Atari, and they actually have an interesting story behind them. With that said, leave a like if you enjoyed this video, it helps out the YouTube algorithm. If you enjoy retro content and obscure stories, drop a subscription. It's a small thing, but it honestly really helps me out. So anyway, let's get right to the video. It was the early 80s. Two skilled developers, Doug McRae and Steve Golson, were attending MIT and noticed the popularity of arcade games. They saw it as an opportunity to start a business inside of their dorm room. They bought numerous arcade games, including Missile Command. This drew in students to put in quarters, which meant McRae and Golson were making money. At first, they were making a killing. In fact, they were able to pay their entire college tuition off by just using the money they made from their arcade machines. But McRae and Golson noticed the students were getting better at their games, meaning they weren't spending as many quarters, so they both thought of an ingenious idea. McRae and Golson focused their attention on Missile Command. Here, you control a crosshair and you have to shoot down the missiles before they hit your bases. But you can also run out of counter missiles, so you have to be careful not to waste them. As you progress, the game does get harder, but McRae and Golson wanted to make it even more difficult so students would have to put in more quarters. McRae and Golson came up with a conversion kit that could be installed in existing Missile Command arcade cabinets that would make the game more difficult. Their new game would be called Super Missile Attack. It was basically Missile Command, but the missiles were faster, more frequent, and your counter missile hitboxes were smaller and therefore harder to hit the enemy missiles. By making the original Missile Command more difficult, students would lose more often, meaning they would have to put more quarters in. But the two realized they could do more than just upgrade their own arcade machines. They could sell their conversion kits to other arcade owners. By 1981, McRae and Golson teamed up with other MIT students to create the company General Computer Corporation, or GCC, and they would start off by selling conversion kits for arcade machines. For some arcade owners, it made sense to buy conversion kits rather than paying anywhere from $3,000 to $4,000 on a brand new arcade machine. They could just purchase a conversion kit from GCC for only $295. In the first 4 months, they sold 1,000 units of Super Missile Attack, meaning they racked in $250,000. With the success of their first conversion, they focused their attention on one of the most successful arcade games, Pac-Man. They realized they could make the game better and add more levels, and since this is a high-profile game, they would most likely sell a lot of conversion kits. Eventually, their conversion kit was completed and became Crazy Otto. Crazy Otto offered a lot more replayability than Pac-Man because it had more levels and each level was a different color. But there was a problem that prevented them from selling the conversion kits. Atari finally took notice. When GCC made a conversion kit for Missile Command, the developers of the game, Atari, originally didn't know about it. When they eventually did find out, they sued GCC for copyright infringement, but the case never went to court, instead they settled. GCC had to start getting permission from the original developers before making conversion kits. They had to turn over the rights to two of their original games, Food Fight and Quantum. These were both games that GCC developed themselves, not ones they modified. Because of the lawsuit, GCC couldn't sell their crazy auto conversion kits, so they thought of an idea. So Midway, the US distributor of Pac-Man, was waiting for the developer of the game, Namco, to make a sequel, but was getting impatient. Midway loved Pac-Man, and even though they were only the distributor and not the actual creators, they plastered their name all over advertisements, even saying, quote, "Midway's amazing new 1 or 2 player full-color video game," unquote. Since GCC couldn't sell their crazy auto conversion kits, they sold the rights to Midway instead, who modified the game further and turned it into Ms. Pac-Man. Because GCC was technically the original creator of this game, the rights to Ms. Pac-Man would partially belong to them up until 2019. After the lawsuit, Atari and GCC joined forces and started cooperating on future projects. This is when GCC showed how capable they really were. So Atari wasn't a big fan of how some of their arcade games turned out on the 2600 and was interested in outsourcing the conversion of arcade games to someone else. They knew GCC was great at working with arcade games. After all, look at Super Missile Attack. So they commissioned them to port over some of Atari's arcade games to the 2600. Despite Atari and GCC having their differences, Atari probably realized that GCC has some great talent and potential and decided to swallow their pride. One of the first games Atari wanted GCC to port to the 2600 was Centipede. Looking at it now, this is actually a near-perfect translation of the arcade original. It feels the same and plays the same, not a single aspect got cut. Usually with games that are ported over to the 2600, there are things that have to be dropped due to limitations, but here they got it right. The only downgrade really is in the graphics department. So the fact that this game has a title screen at all is impressive, but I'm shocked at how nice this looks. Honestly, it looks better than the actual game. So how do they pull this off? And also, why couldn't they just make the actual game look like the title screen? Well, I have the answer. The mushrooms on the title screen are sprites. Normally a pixel on the 2600 is a long rectangle, but sprites are actually immune to this rule, so they can be drawn to look like mushrooms. But the drawback is, like most consoles, too many sprites lined up horizontally can cause flickering and slowdowns. The moving centipede in the center is stacked vertically, so it doesn't pose a problem in this department. Going back to the mushrooms, the 2600 has a very interesting ability to use sprite clones. This allows you to place an exact copy of the sprite next to the original, and it only counts as one sprite, so flickering will be at a minimum. But the copied sprites can only be put on the right side of the original, and they have to be a certain amount of pixels away. Now that we know this, we can see that the title screen has quite a few cloned sprites, which will reduce any possible flickering or slowdowns. Looking at the actual gameplay, the mushrooms are drawn using playfield graphics, which as we talked about before, have to be long rectangles, so they look much less detailed than the ones that are on the title screen. So the question you might have here is why not use the mushroom sprites in the actual game then? Well, if you've played Centipede before, the screen can get filled with mushrooms very quickly. You don't want the mushrooms to be sprites because the game would flicker a lot, and cloning the sprites wouldn't be effective because the copies have to be exactly a certain amount of pixels away. On the title screen, the developers have control over how many mushrooms they can put on screen. In the actual game, they don't. With playfield graphics, on the other hand, there's no limit to how many mushrooms are allowed to be put on screen. So the fact that GCC was able to pull this off is unbelievable. We have a nice looking title screen and a game that feels just like the arcade original. Maybe Atari made the right decision to give GCC a chance. GCC would be commissioned to port over other games as well, including but not limited to Atari Video Cube, a decent puzzle game with a nice rotation effect, Joust, a surprisingly accurate port of the arcade original, Battlezone, a very impressive first-person combat game, Moon Patrol, a shooter that has retained the parallax scrolling. Pole Position, a 3D racing game I didn't even think was possible on the 2600. Vanguard, a shooter that contains both vertical and horizontal scrolling. Ms. Pac-Man, a decent port that manages to retain the 4 levels. And Junior Pac-Man, an extremely impressive port that has 7 levels and retains the scrolling. GCC also made a port of Millipede, but there might have been a miscommunication here because Atari also made their own version in-house, so there's 2 versions of Millipede on the 2600. Despite how well they did on Centipede, GCC's version of Millipede plays a lot more choppy and slow. It's not up to their standard, and doesn't quite feel like the arcade original, but at least the title screen also looks nice. Atari's own version plays much better and feels more like the arcade version, but to be fair, GCC's version was never released. It's unknown why they made it in the first place when Atari was planning on making their own. So in conclusion, despite Atari's previous issues with GCC, teaming up with them was very smart. They created some very well translated and impressive ports of arcade titles. GCC's involvement with Atari had a very positive impact. So it started out as 2 college students who wanted to make some money. Their efforts got the attention of bigger companies like Atari and Midway. Even though Atari had a lawsuit with them, they recognized their talents and they commissioned them to make games for the 2600. It's clear that GCC had a positive impact in gaming history, not only with Namco and Midway, but with Atari as well. Hey, thanks so much for watching, guys. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like rating. It only takes a second and it gets my video noticed by more people. Also, if you enjoy my content, drop a subscription, that way you'll be notified when my next video comes out. Plus, it's completely free. Finally, drop a comment if you have any questions, suggestions, or just want to share your gaming experiences. This greatly helps the YouTube algorithm, and I'm usually pretty good at replying back. Anyway, have a good one, guys.